has been really good for folks. So hopefully I will continue that progress. When I was preparing for this, I had a colleague look at my first set of slide decks, and she mentioned that perhaps I was preparing to teach a class. So hopefully we can pare it down and also have some really good and useful information. And please raise your hand or put it in the chat if you have questions as we go along, because it is an overwhelming amount of information. My name again is Sue Benolken. I work at the Minnesota Department of Education. I've been around for a really, really long time. I started my career with children with special needs way back in high school when I worked at a home for severely handicapped kids. And I worked as a regional coordinator as the collaboratives were beginning to emerge, as the early intervention and community interagency transition committees were beginning to emerge. So I was in on the ground floor of some of those problem solving and planning activities. Then I had a rather long stint in the Department of Human Services, learned a lot at the Department of Human Services, and then went back to education at the State Department of Education. During that long and checkered history, there's been a lot of changes in education in general that I've been really pleased to be a part of, but know that especially as these twin pandemics have surfaced, we have a long way to go. So hopefully I can give you some of the supports and services that we have in place that we're really working on to expand and enhance as we go forth. Let's see, I'm going to set up my slides here just a sec, and we'll get started. Takes me just a second here to there you go. Good. Everybody see that? Great. Okay. So we have a very long and very kind of non-exciting topic, but that's what we're going to try to talk about today is what adaptations and considerations that schools and communities have been experiencing during COVID and during the racial tensions that have occurred over this past year. Okay, so in the Department of Ed, we usually like to start all of our presentations with kind of a reminder to ourselves and others that we have identified at least 10 Minnesota commitments to equity. And today we're going to really look at services and supports that prioritize equity, that value people, that improve conditions for learning, and hopefully give students options. And before we get started, I just wanted to kind of give you, this is kind of a hard and very complex reading thing, but as Governor Walz came into his office, one of the things that they worked on was trying to create what they call the Due North Education Plan, which they really have tried to prioritize what needs to happen for students as we go forward under his administration. And he did this by collecting lots of community information, but basically the plan includes actions to support students during COVID-19, reform our finance system. If anyone knows anything about school finance, it's very, very complicated. Expand opportunities for students in greater Minnesota, build a more qualified and diverse teaching force. And this plan would ensure academic standards to address the modern needs for workforce and make sure that they're inclusive of ethnic studies and reflective of students of color and Indigenous students in order to close the opportunity gaps and end disparities. So he goes through many of these kind of actions, and then the department has gone through and tried to create strategies and action steps to actualize that. So that's kind of a pillar of our work now that we go forward, trying to make sure that things fit into the Due North Education Plan. And you can find that right on the first page of the Minnesota Department of Education's website if you want to go further into that. or if you get these slides, you can just click here and you can find it. Okay, so today, as I said, we're going to explore some evidence-based practices that have been used to support learning during this pandemic and beyond. And kind of equity, creative collaboration, and flexibility remain critical in meeting the needs of students. These have been really important words. My title, for example, is that of Interagency Coordination Specialist. And I say that only in recognition that as special education has evolved, there's been a growing recognition that we cannot in education really serve students and families well unless we collaborate. The collaboration across homeschool and community is a really important concept. In fact, the Department of Education now has a whole unit in special ed dedicated to interagency coordination. So a whole group of us that work with our interagency partners. And of course, equity has really risen to the top. Creativity and flexibility, as we've watched people adapt and change during this COVID-19 epidemic, has also become heightened and increased. We've recognized the need. So I wanted to make sure that those words kind of encapsulated what we were going to go through today. So the transition, as we've said, to and from distance learning has been a challenge in many ways, mentally, physically, and emotionally. I think we all can testify to that. And really, science and experience shows us that learning is disrupted with trauma and stress, and even simple disruptions of routine. And this challenges all. However, I think we also need to recognize that everyone has been having a very different experience. There have been some kids and students who have thrived in this more distance learning environment, and other students, for example, who've really struggled, and teachers and all the rest of those people who support families. There is on our Minnesota Department of Education website a dashboard that kind of gives a summary of where schools are in terms of distance, hybrid, or some other kind of form, so that you can see kind of the larger percentage of students who are in what learning model, if you're interested in tracking that. What we did find was students with disabilities particularly struggled a lot with the lack of in-person services. In fact, we were very thrilled to see that our percentage had risen to 67% of students were in-person learning from almost zero at the beginning of this pandemic. So we've made great progress, but we still have a long way to go. And we had to really institute a lot of supports and flexibility, which we'll talk about later on, to really kind of focus in on the needs of this particular student group. So we continue to provide evidence-based practices that support the needs of diverse learners before, during, and after the pandemic. So some of these include, and we're going to talk about a little bit these, so hopefully you've heard of most of them, the positive behavioral intervention supports, PBIS, check and connect, person-centered practices, restorative justice. We have some interagency and collaborative structures that have been reinforced and built during this time frame, and some specific ethnic kinds of work around like dream catchers and cultural liaisons. So hopefully we'll talk about some of those and a few others that you might be interested in as we move on. Okay, so before we get into that, any questions or comments that people have about kind of the background? Jenna, nothing in the chat? Great. Okay, so PBIS. PBIS is an evidence-based framework that is designed for preventing behavior problems, providing instruction and support for positive pro-social behaviors, and supporting the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of students. It is evidence-based practice, and it is Um, it talks about team-based implementation and building capacity. And you'll see that this is kind of a map of where current PBIS work is being done across the state. We still have a ways to go, and each year they're doing more and more cohort training to try to enhance the capacity of Minnesota to provide PBIS services. What they wanted to do was to try to put out some information about how you can use PBIS in this environment. So first of all, the first message that they send is be kind to yourself and everyone else. We refer to that in the office as having grace. We all need to extend each other and ourselves grace during this period. So then consider the following strategies to kind of make sure that the things that we have learned that are positive in PBIS can also be brought into the various learning models. So for example, don't change the language. We haven't changed PBIS language. We have defined expectations, which is sort of a hallmark of PBIS, is that you actually teach behavioral expectations to students, and they have refreshers online. So we're also doing this, or refreshers periodically, and we are also making sure that we do that online. And we want to have students and families and all of us opportunities to practice those expected behaviors. And we want to continue positive and familiar routines, regardless of the learning environment that you're in. So there's some resource materials that they've also created last March to kind of help do that. Here's an example. I think if any of you have seen this, lots of schools that are participating in PBIS have expectation grids for how you're going to work on certain things, what the expected behavior is. This is designed to bring that into the distant learning environment. So schools that have participated with PBIS have also instituted this for their online and hybrid students to make sure that people know what the expectations are and they teach to those expectations as well. So equity also, I'm not sure if people are aware, but equity in PBIS has become a very important, along with all the rest of us, concept. And really they have come up with some really nice training materials on how to enhance equity, especially around the area of school discipline. That really the 5 points talk about using disaggregated discipline data to make sure that you're really tracking. Are you disproportionately having discipline reports for certain populations, all those kinds of things. So you really monitor and assess and redirect your energies. Really the school-wide PBIS is for culturally responsive behavior support. So what is that? We want to make sure that we've trained people up to make sure that we understand what that is. We want to make sure that we're focusing on effective instruction, that we have effective policies, and that we're reducing bias in discipline decisions. For example, one of the points that they emphasize in this is when you're about to engage in a lot of the discipline reports for kids of diverse backgrounds is, or any backgrounds, essentially is really kind of what I would consider low level, kind of talking back, being disrespectful, those kinds of things that sometimes kids have gotten suspended for or kicked out of class, all those kinds of things. And one of the things they talk about is really slowing those reactive decisions down to make sure that you're more mindful of what's triggering you in those interactions and actually maybe delay any consequences or any discussing with that student until another time, like after school or during lunch or what another time. So we've got some really good concrete kind of steps that they've actually built into some training in the PBIS world. Another really effective evidence-based practice is is Check and Connect. And really the Check and Connect data and information has come right out of the University of Minnesota. And it's basically targeted for those kids, kindergarten through 12th grade, who show disengagement, who are at risk for dropping off. And what that Check and Connect really kind of entails is trying to build a relationship with the student and a caring adult. Essentially, there is an assigned mentor to a student, and they help check in with that student and that student's family to figure out where the disengagement's happening, how can they kind of encourage them back in. To do that's the connection, and really engage with that with the family as well. For example, some kids start losing credits, and it gets so overwhelming for them to even try to keep up. So they just think they'll never catch up, and that's when they're really at risk for dropping out. What the mentor can do with their data sheets is to really monitor where they are in their class schedule and try to help them do some of those credit recovery things, or to keep on track so they don't drop a class or things like that. So it's been a very effective program, and it's being instituted right now in a couple different ways. MDE has a specific partnership with these 4 areas right now. One of the greatest groups of kids that we have tracked data on that are at risk for not graduating are African American students and Indigenous students. So, and also in special education. So those 3 kind of categories. So with Duluth, St. Paul, Osseo, and Minneapolis, we created a 5-year plan where they've got a bit of money, not much, and they got technical assistance from MDE staff to build their capacity to provide Check and Connect programs. Other areas are using Check and Connect. For example, here's an example from Fond du Lac that is using Check and Connect and other programs to create youth engagement zones and other kinds of things to enhance the opportunities for youth in the community. Yet another kind of concept that we've been building and trying to enhance our capacity is that of person-centered practices. A lot of you who work in the mental health field are familiar with wraparound. Some of those kinds, they're essentially the same. You could use student-centered, family-centered. We just sort of capitalize it under person-centered practices, but those are a continuum of strategies and activities that really offer support and informed choice for students and families so that they have day-to-day input on transitions in everyday life. So essentially, we're trying to help families and students leverage their strengths and interests and make informed choice so that they have control and agency over where they learn, work, live, play, and hopefully in the most integrated settings possible. Basically, a core concept is that as students and families take the lead in some of these discussions and decision-making activities. So some of the practices or the key features, again, are, and practices, I'm going to take a minute. Practice are strategies and activities that are teachable, doable, repeatable, and measurable. In my early years, when we used to talk about family-centered and person-centered practices, we talked about things like, it was almost like a gestalt. Of course, I'm good with families. I accept families. It's a way of being with families. What the current iteration of person-centered and wraparound and family-centered practices are really a set of really tangible materials and programs that you can institute that you can teach people to do. They're actually doable, and you can measure them. So features are strength-based, person-led, involves people across homeschool and community, honors and takes into account issues of race, culture, sexual orientation, age, gender, etc. Information about the student family preferences are used, and informed choice helps us balance that information about what's important to and important for a student or a family. We're often really good at coming in with diagnostics and things about saying what's important to you. You must take this class, you have to do this. But what's important for the person? What are their motivating factors? What feeds their energy? How can they contribute more in the activities and decision makings about those activities? So some of those person-centered practices, we have some names, there's some trademark packages, there's wraparound, renew. We'll talk about a couple of these as we go along, but there are many. MDE now has chosen 4 of them to work on over the next couple of years in an implementation science way to try to help build capacity across the state. So we've chosen to really focus in on renew, charting the life course, path, and picture of a life. So renew is a specific trademark activity that has its own set of training. It is basically an activity to help folks, particularly with social emotional behavior challenges, or could be applied anywhere, but talks about transition planning and individualized programming. So it's student focused and focused on personal futures. It has an individualized team development that includes transition planning. It implements strategies to link youth with natural and paid supports. And obviously, this is a medical word, but discharge to less intensive services. Or if a child or a youth is transitioning from student-based to more adult world kinds of services, we're hoping that they're transitioning into less intensive density. But again, this is a really evidence-based practice, and it specifically involves the student and the family in the direct planning of their system of supports. Obviously, I don't need to talk to a lot of you too much about wraparound, but basically that's sort of an intensive individualized care planning process for those children and youth with complex mental health. WRAP Minnesota is a process that kind of focuses around these same kind of, they begin to look pretty similar, slightly different wording, but these are grounded in strengths. They're driven by the needs, they're determined by families, and supported by an effective team process. So the one that I'm most familiar with and have been working on is charting the life course. And basically it is that the belief is that all people and their families have the right to live, love, work, and play and pursue their life aspirations in the community. And this doesn't only apply to children and youth with special educational needs. This program was designed for all, and they do mean all. I went through a training process and I used a couple of tools to help me look at my transition into retirement. What kinds of things do I need to have in place to make that transition to a successful retirement activity? Scared the heck out of me, let me tell you. Anyway, charting the life course is a framework. It's more of a framework and it has some specific tools. It was developed by families and self-advocates for families. And it basically is to help at any stage of life, develop a vision for a good life and think about what they need to know, identify how to find and develop supports, and discover what it takes. The application with younger kids, I think, is really an important concept where we start to look at what kids need to do to be successful as they grow up and age into adulthood, and really trying to identify some things that they're interested in. For example, one of the tools is, let's see if I go through here. One of the tools, for example, is this profile one-page profile where you kind of talk or the student or the family identifies what's really important to me, what are my interests, what's important to me, and how you best can support me. There's some really great applications for this one-page profile. It's a great introduction if you're transitioning into a new grade or a new teacher or a new set of colleagues or student group that you're working with. What's really key is you can leverage some really good ideas. For example, if a student talks about their likes and interests, say they're really interested in horses, and you're really struggling with trying to get this kid to read, for example, they don't like to read. Maybe we can curate some information on or in stories about horses. Try to leverage that interest and match with an academic outcome. How best to support me? Some kids really want to be supported with positive affirmations on a regular basis. Some kids really want to be able to have a timeout when they get really kind of overwhelmed, and what kind of timeout works the best for them. So this really gives you great information right from the family and the person themselves. Some of the other tools, for example, are really good around planning is the trajectory tool. Basically, the trajectory doesn't have to even be on a tool. It's basically 3 questions. What's your vision for a good life or a day? You can use it as a day tool as well as a long-term planning tool. What don't you want to have happen? And what steps are you going to take to get there? This is really a great tool to use for transition age students, but also it really can be used for kids and families in the classroom in elementary or earlier grades as well. Particularly if you kind of condense it down to what makes a good week. What kinds of things can we do to support you having a good week? What don't you want to have happen during a week? You don't want to be yelled at. You don't want to be isolated. You want to be able to work in groups. Whatever that student or family together can articulate would make a good week for you. I will point out they've got a lot of really interesting tools that talk about your life stages and your domains. And they have some really good questions, key questions to ask. So they're really good guides to planning. So I'm going to stop here for a second and talk about other ways that schools are adapting. Those are sort of the big programmatic areas that we've had in place all along that we're actually trying to roll out with greater intensity because they seem to really fit the needs of the trauma of the current pandemic, as well as the racial tensions and the lack of good equity planning. They really are individual focused, and they're also system focused to try to really wrap a system around an individual.
Sue, there was a question in the chat about if there's a link to those education materials.
Yes, there is, and at the end of this, I will. They're all there for you.
Awesome. And then I did mention that these slides, if you're okay with it, will be available to everyone at the end of the gathering.
Perfect. Okay, great. Now, if I was in person, here's my transparency here. If I was in person, I'd be wandering around. I'd be getting all the feedback from your faces and whatnot. So forgive me if I don't manage to keep my energy quite up to where I would be, because this is a little struggle. I haven't really mastered it yet in all the year long that we've had. So far we're doing good, I think. So let's move on. One of the things that we've had to really enhance and leverage is our infrastructure supports. And as I said before, MD has made a commitment to interagency coordination, and there are many partnerships that exist across the state and locally. We have a DHS and MDH interagency agreements working on improving outcomes for children and families. That's a 5-year interagency agreement where staff between all those agencies get together and work on. In fact, Charting the Life course is a 3-agency partnership at this point, actually 4, because we have DEED as well, working on trying to implement that across all of our programs. We have a memorandum of understanding with vocational rehabilitation. Of course, you know, there's the Children's Cabinet. The Olmsted work has been prevalent. What we have instituted was an interagency pandemic problem-solving group where we met we're kind of backing off a little bit. For a while, we met weekly to kind of talk about what's happening to our families and students and how could we work together to better enhance that. For example, when I mentioned that students with disabilities were particularly struggling with distance learning because of some physical barriers or more intense focus needs. And we were not allowed to go into those homes to provide that kind of support. But many of those families already had in-home support, but because of some definitional labels that we had, is that those folks that were in folks' home, personal care attendants, could not help with educational activities. So we were able to suspend that and able to offer some resources and supports to enable those people who are already coming into the homes and continue to come into some of those homes as with personal care, they could also help with school activities. So that was a really tangible interagency result that affected the ability to have students access their educational activities during the pandemic. We've also really increased our interagency and advocate organization meetings. We've had lots of town halls. We actually now have an ongoing meeting with advocates in special ed, but we're also looking at cultural groups to come in and give us information on what's needed, how can we be more present, and what kind of activities would they recommend. And they would learn from us what kind of supports we had available that they could take it back to their advocacy organizations and the families that participate. We also talked, excuse me, we also talked about local district implementation projects, PBIS being one huge example. The Check and Connect that I talked about is another one. We really try to make sure that whatever we're doing is we're trying to really look at the local districts as well as the state agency partnerships. We have participation. I participate, for example, in the Children's Mental Health Task Force. So we have cross participation in our work groups. And another area of work that we are working cross-agency on is school-linked mental health. Obviously, there's local collaboratives that are local school partnerships. What we have found, interestingly enough, that folks are reporting to us that those areas that had active participants did better in the pandemic. They were able to pivot more quickly and were able to offer a more varied set of services. That's kind of a duh, but it was nice to see that it was really our belief that that would be what happened actually happened. So those areas that already had those connections with people did better. They didn't have to struggle so hard to get those partnerships in place. So that was an exciting piece of news, and really, I hope underscores the work that you guys are all doing, bringing your resources and expertise into schools and helping kind of help students and families thrive during these times. Here's another example of Duluth, for example, is doing as are a lot of schools, partnering with their Indian Ed groups, particularly during the pandemic, to really make sure that we have engagement and capacity, that we still have those relationships, and that we're still providing culturally relevant curriculum, no matter what learning model that they're in. So that lots of schools have really tried to enhance that work as they've gone on. The Dreamcatcher project is a lot of words here, but that's been a project that's been ongoing for a couple of years that really trains American Indian liaisons or cultural staff to work with folks in various communities. There are currently 37 sites in areas with high enrollment of Indigenous students. During the pandemic, some of the things that they were able to do was really doing some great problem solving about getting technology access for distance learning and tracking down families who quote gone off the grid. So those cultural liaisons were able in those 37 sites, particularly in rural communities, really getting them reconnected with school as they've gone on. They've distributed many, backpacks, school supplies, etc. And in the spring of 2020, they began weekly Zoom chats amongst them to really kind of help problem solve around outreach to students and families, to share district resources and gather input regarding COVID response in quote Indian country, unquote. So that group of folks in those 37 sites have really been able to keep a message, keep connections, and facilitate involvement across this whole pandemic period. We have an entire division that's called Ensuring Safe and Supported Schools. And basically that area of MDE has always focused in on certain key elements like bullying prevention, school training, school safety, school climate, restorative practice, social mold. All those kind of concepts are in this division at MDE. So one of those areas is restorative practices, and I'm sure many of you have seen restorative practices in actions or have used them. Basically, they're drawn from the traditions of Indigenous people and communities of color around the world. They're grounded in the belief that people are profoundly interconnected and inherently good. And basically, these practices are used to build healthy relationships and create community within a school. They help obviously build school climate, prevent bullying and harm, and help repair harm. And I think that's where most of us have some knowledge of restorative practices as a way of repairing harm, but they also have those preventative and protective factors when you really are installing restorative practices in your school community. So I wanted to highlight that one. Some other resources. The MDE website also has information specifically on COVID-19 resources that range from early childhood. They have a family engagement toolkit. They have family guides. They have descriptions of federal programs and school climate and mental health. There's a lot of long-winded documents there, but they also have some really nice information that you might want to be able to check out. So what we're working on now, essentially, we're approaching obviously better pandemic status. More and more kids and families are back at schools, but we recognize that recovery is going to be an important kind of concept for the next couple of years. So basically, we have some guidance out right now that we're encouraging school districts, charter schools, and parents in making equitable and individualized determinations of appropriate extended school year services, general education recovery services, revision of current IEP services, and COVID-19 compensatory services that are targeted for students with disabilities. The other things are not necessarily just targeted to students with disabilities. So this is really the next bit of work, along with trying to maintain really good, solid, evidence-based practices that build school climate, that encourage student and family engagement. We also need to actually look at what we need to put in place to help students and families recover from this year of learning. So for example, some of the recovery services are things like, is somebody asking a question? Nope, okay. Summer programming, obviously. So I don't know if you guys are aware of what your districts that you work with, what kind of summer programming are they offering for the years for over the summer. But we're really encouraging summer programming that's more enrichment based in many ways. Obviously offering ongoing student tutoring and small group instruction, making sure that kids and families still have high quality materials, that they're culturally appropriate, that social emotional supports such as counseling and school social work are really easily available, even during the summer, because sometimes that's not available during the summer. But people are really trying to, there are a couple bills in the legislature as well that are trying to beef up that in school counseling and social work. We want to make sure that we curate and use as many resources for staff on trauma-informed practices and other ways to support well-being and mental health. So that's an activity that the State Department is working on in partnership with some of you and other state departments as well. We really want to make sure that we leverage that notion of multi-tiered supports, which what are universal needs for kids? Then what are the supports in place for kids that might need a little bit of help? And what are the supports in place for those kids who need a lot of help? So it's tiered. So the universal targeted to all students, regardless of age, gender, racial identity, disability status, what's available. For example, PBIS uses a really good multi-tiered support implementation strategy where all students, for example, are taught the expectations for the school building. How do you move through the school building? What's the behavior that's expected of you? They offer really great universal practices of like welcoming kids as they come into schools or welcoming them on a distance learning kind of thing so that you really do connect with students on a personal level. Universal kinds of things that build school climate. And then those kids that might need some reading help, might need some extra kinds of supports, and those kids who might need some more really intensive mental health services or whatever are actually built into your system of practice. We want to make sure that families have information regarding mental health, especially. We want to make sure that they really are wrapping around services, both in the way of the wraparound services like WRAP Minnesota, but also making sure that we have homeschooling community wrapped around a school community so that we can really leverage those partnerships. And then again, like I mentioned, a lot of recommendations, particularly around student programming, to be enrichment activities, classes, etc. So those are just a few examples of some of the things that your local school districts will be looking at and implementing as recovery services. Compensatory services are those focused for those kids who particularly have been in special education and who have lost skills, academic, functional, or behavior. That any lack of expected progress in the general curriculum or toward the student IEP annual goals that resulted from the school districts or school districts delay or inability to provide the IEP services during the appropriate during the pandemic. So we really are expecting people to kind of look at that student's IEP, have meetings early in the year to really kind of look at what we need to increase or add to the students' IEP. We want to make sure that as we go forth, we must prioritize equity. We must prepare in a way that is flexible enough to respond to
I
uncertainty,
went to the bathroom and some lady had to stop me so she could.
and yet robust enough for all students, including students with disabilities, that they have an equal opportunity to succeed over the long term and help to ensure that equity is built into the foundation of the new era of education. So that's kind of our mission statement as we go forward, as we move into this hopefully post-pandemic year, where we really begin to focus in on what we need to do to continue working on priority and continue to offer supports to students and families. So I blew through that awfully quickly. Please ask me some questions.
Yeah, let's open it up to the group. Let's have some questions.
And I noticed that I didn't have in my slide some of the question that was answered or asked before about the connections to some of those resources like Charting the Life course. I will make sure I add those and then send it to you or to Jenna or probably to Emily as here's the final PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Yep. So I'll make sure that I add that in there. Can you guys talk to me about some things that you've seen good or things that you've seen as struggles as you've partnered with schools over the last year?
This is Beth Bagan. I have some concern about kids coming back to school next fall who have had anxiety anyway about school, or maybe weren't big fans of school before COVID. And so it was an opportunity for them to pull back, in some cases pull way back. And I just worry that we're going to have an influx of kids where we're all assuming, well, we're back to normal. Let's all, go through those doorways. And and I don't know that we're really prepared for what that would look like. We've been talking about, do we need some kind of a group process? We're putting them in smaller groups, those kids, and what would that look like? And how would we manage that? And we get paid by billing insurance companies, and that would make that process absolutely ridiculous. So we're looking at some of that money that's coming through. I can't remember the name of it, and seeing if we can, seeing if we can use that to do some short-term groups, not therapy groups in the traditional sense, but that small group. You're back at school. What are you worried about? What are your anxieties? And then creating it by grade level. So there's maybe some friendships formed, but I haven't had time to really talk to the school people about it. They're trying to wrap up the year and get away, which I can't blame them. So, but we're all kind of worried about what that's going to look like in the fall. And I think I don't know. I hope it's not a tsunami of issues, but I just think it's going to be interesting, because the hallmark of anxiety is avoidance, and COVID really gave kids that opportunity to avoid school. So
right.
Anyway,
and I appreciate that, and that is a concern that I've heard my colleagues and educational folks across the state talk about. Is there have been some kids who, like I said, thrived in this distance environment, whether it's because they were finally in an environment where they could manage their anxiety better than in a group setting, or whatever the reason. But yeah, expecting everybody back and just to be, hey, everything's fine, we're going back. I don't think anybody has that expectation. That I think they're going to have to really be cognizant. And I think people really have had an increased awareness of mental health and well-being kinds of issues as being things we need to pay attention to. But we need the help of you guys to kind of remind us to slow down sometimes, and just, you know, in the effort to get everybody back, you sort of do large group stuff, you forget the individuals sometimes. So that'll be really helpful for, and I'm hoping that there'll be some schools that'll be meeting over the summer to plan that more intensively. Or with intention is probably a better grammatical way to say that, so that we really can plan for those contingencies. I will also suggest that we look to the MDE website for COVID resources. I think we're going to be writing some tips and strategies for opening school again in a more systemic way. Anybody else have any kind of comments or things that you've seen that have worked, things that you've seen are worrisome?
There's a couple of things in the chat. So someone said they're glad to hear and see references to wraparound services and philosophy, excuse me. And then, and talk about the mental health of the staff. Are they in a place where they are ready for the students?
That's a good point.
I guess
Point.
not having diagnosed many of them, I can just go on what I've heard and seen. People are stressed. I mean, like we all have been. And I think what Beth, you mentioned, that people are just ready now to be done for a while. I think a break is needed. I think some teachers, as students, have really thrived in this environment, have really thought this was a engaging way to engage with students, that they had less classroom management issues to deal with, you know. But to a person, everyone I've talked to have been worried about the students. And I think that that's been the overarching kind of mental health anxiety thing for teachers, is especially those students that seem to be kind of disappearing, dropping out. What I think they want to bring with them into the future is the family engagement piece. I think a lot of people were stressed, but also very comforted in being able to kind of have a more intimate, by nature of distance. I mean, you can see everything that in my dining room. This is my home. You are now in my home. I'm presenting you to you from my home. So you really got more family connection than you do typically. And I think there's a lot of students and families too that have really appreciated that, and that teachers have found that very fulfilling, to be able to have a better relationship with the entire family of students as they go along. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yes, the mental health of staff. I know superintendents and directors talk about that all the time, how they can support their teaching staff and their custodians and lunch people and every bus folks. They've all need to be able to kind of come together in a way that makes them feel safe and connected.
Yeah, there's just another thing in the chat. Someone just mentioned that it says the DL students, and I'm wondering if that means Detroit Lakes students. I'm not sure if that's what the DL students means, but the DL students out on the res and on the outskirts of town. Oh, distance learner. Thank you. Sorry. The distance learning students out on the res and on the outskirts of town have had a terrible luck with internet service streaming capabilities and fell so far behind that they gave up. So it just, that was something else in the chat. So is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, other than the fact that I know that there's going to be, it's not going to help now necessarily, but the infrastructure issues that we have in the state were definitely highlighted during this last year, and the disproportionate people or people who have been really impacted by that. So I know that the state probably is going to be investing some of the COVID funds in trying to build out that infrastructure a little bit more. I know education folks have really tried hard with hotspots and running things out to folks the best they could. But it definitely is an issue that needs to be addressed. And that's going to be part of that recovery aspect that we have to look at. Are those kids out in those rural areas or on the reservation being really impacted by the lack of technology? What kinds of recovery services do we need to put in place for them so that they don't feel like they have to give up, that they don't feel like they've missed a whole year and need to start someplace else? So how do we do that in a respectful way and in a way that encourages trying and connection as opposed to disengagement? Let's see if I can jump on the chat too. So right, the fact is that they are behind. So hopefully what I talked about in those recovery phases, that really trying to look at how do we build some of those small groups, that tutoring, that bringing additional kind of resources, that summer engagement kinds of activities. Hopefully that those local areas are making plans right now to begin to do that, not only during the summer, but actually during the school year. There's some question of, do we need to offer extended school hours for some of those kids and families? Do we need to offer little groups of timeframes where we have enrichment activities going on as well? So we still are basically trying to build that capacity and that awareness right now. Parents have requested ways to expunge failed credits for high school who failed. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not currently up to date with the recommendations on that, but I think there's going to be some really strong statements about that as we go forward. And you're right. Everybody has had a different experience with COVID, making it much more difficult to plan or feel comfortable in what's coming next. It will take time and grace, yes, and relationships to make it work. I appreciate that a lot. If we didn't need grace this last year, we're going to really need it again this year, because really everybody's going to not starting out at equal footing. We're not all in the same place, and just because you're in sixth grade doesn't mean you're ready for sixth grade at this point. So we really have to, and I think that's the message. Hopefully you're hearing from me and other agencies that we really want to support districts and the people who wrap around districts to support that notion of grace and really effort to try to help kids and families catch up, recover, manage what's been going on for this last year.
How do you see the Department of Education providing, I guess grace is the best word, around the whole testing and scores and all of that schools feel so pressured about? So it's like hit the ground running on teaching, because we're teaching for the school, that whole, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. The high stakes testing. Well, we did manage this last year to not have that be part of the pressure for the last year. That testing took place in very limited kind of focus. I think both the federal and the local state have really looked at those are going to be asterished scores that come out with asterisks, like this was not a true capture of the students' abilities or the teaching that went on that year. So I do think there'll be some grace extended during this next year as well. I don't think we've been successful in eliminating the requirement for those tests yet. I think there's a push from certain communities to do that. But I do think that really folks are acutely aware that that's not going to be truly reflective of actual reality. And we're talking with superintendents and districts about that as well.
I wonder if they can be used as a measure of where your students are at and not how your school is looked at. I mean, those are two very different ways that those scores, I think, play out you know.
Yeah, and that's already in some of the discussions I've heard within the department, is that you almost are using those as baseline scores now to say, okay, where are the kids and what do we need to do to enhance that? So that dialogue is happening. Whether it filters out as far as we would like that to filter out locally, we're working on that as well. That is also kind of the disconnect that we're hearing sometimes, is the department says one thing, but my school district is not doing that. And again, independent school districts for a reason. That's why the name is there. But we are trying our best to make sure that there is not uniformity, because there never will be, but at least all the districts are aware of what they can and should be providing. But if you guys are running into some significant, issues or barriers, please call the department and, let them know that we're struggling in this community on X, Y, or Z. And so we can focus in on that. Becky, I appreciate that. It's not an actual reflection of where the students are either. It gives us an indicator. It is just one of many indicators as to where a student's at. I would never, even in regular times, ever interpret that test result as being an accurate reflection of the student's abilities or knowledge base. So I absolutely agree. Any other comments, questions, reactions? Well, I can't thank you enough for your kind attention. And I hope I was at least articulate. I went through that stuff kind of fast, and I did cut a lot of stuff out of there. So I will get those resources added to the PowerPoint, the MDE website, particularly for the COVID-19 resources and other things, is constantly being updated. We've slowed down a little bit, but I think there'll be a flurry of activity over the summer, particularly about getting back to school plans and what we would recommend, kind of those things. So please monitor that. If you want to call me or contact me in any way, shape, or form on any of these issues, I'd be really happy. If I don't know the answer, I'll make sure I connect you to the right place within the department. So with that, I guess you get an extra few minutes to kind of take a break, relax. Jenna, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just thank you so much, Sue, for all of your quality, engaging information. And thank you all for the questions that you've been asking too. It really helps, helps us co-learn together. So I appreciate that. What's next on the schedule is a mindfulness activity at 12:15 to 12:45. It's like a lunch mindfulness eating thing. Feel free to bring food to it if you'd like. I put the link to the gathering webpage in the chat. That's where you can access the rest of the links. I'm assuming that's where you all have been accessing the links, but it's just a quick way to click on that really and access it through the chat. Yeah, other than that, if you are not planning on joining the mindfulness activity, I hope to see you at our keynote session at 1 o'clock with Dr. Diaz. And yes, that's it. You guys get an extra 10 minutes of lunchtime before then. So thank you all.
The gift of time.
Yes.